All right. Well, thanks everyone for coming. This talk is about production, but that type of production where you're a small team and you really want to be doing production stuff, but nobody is really a producer. That's the that's what we're going to be talking about today, because I think for small teams, often production is an expense that feels hard to justify. Um, we'll talk about that in a little bit. But this is kind of roughly what we're going to be talking about today: is how to do production when you don't really have a producer, how to get away with the best that you can until you can get a producer. Um, so to take that concept and make it sound like a dry presentation title, I'm calling it Production Basics for Indie Teams. This is maybe a bit over the top, but I think it is worth just kind of touching on the idea of production conceptually. What is it? Because I think it means a lot of different things to a lot of different teams. Often producers that I speak to will have done a lot of things ranging from QA to just kind of wrangling Jira, and there's all kinds of different things that it can mean. The basic gist of what I think of as production, and obviously I have my own specific spin on it, this might be different to somebody else. I see it as solving problems, right? Or at least at its first level, solving problems, and then when you become a really good producer, it becomes about predicting problems and kind of pre-solving them so that they don't ever affect the rest of the team. A lot of the things that you'll think of as production, like managing Trello or Jira boards or whatever tool that you get into, and kind of high-level tracking and planning, really what this is a facet of solving or predicting and then solving problems. So reports and all these kinds of things are just ways for you to get out in front of the team so that you can see what's going to go wrong before it goes wrong, you know? I'll kind of say one more time, this is production like any other part of game development is specific, right? Like different teams have different ways of working, and so production needs to be specific to the team that you are, specific to your team. And so I'm going to give some kind of general recommendations and talk about tools in the general sense, because I think there is things to learn in the abstract, of course, but something that's quite important is being willing to make things work for your team. We'll talk about that a bit later. I have one more important preface before we get into the actual meat of the stuff that we're talking about, which is that, again, kind of maybe a bit of an obvious one, but important to point out. Production is an aspect of game development, right? Like, what I mean by that is similar to what you may think of as more getting your hands dirty parts of game development, programming, art, sound, whatever it is. You'll get out of production what you put into it from a time and effort perspective, right? Production is something that I think a lot of teams feel they can go without, or at least scrape by without dedicated production staff. That's definitely something that I've thought, and in some ways continue to think. But it is important to kind of note, you will get out of production what you put into it. This talk is going to be targeted at bridging the gap between a team that is small enough to feel that they don't need a producer and a team that can afford a producer. But really, you're never going to be able to do production as well as somebody who dedicates their time to being a producer, right? That's just kind of the fact of the matter. In the same way that, you can do programmer art as a bit of a meme. If you're a programmer and kind of want to have some art in your game, great. You can put in a little bit of time to cover the real basic stuff, but obviously you're never going to be as good as just having an artist that spends more time and energy on that facet of the game. So I think that's important to note. Like, you can kind of get away with just the basics, but it's not going to lead to the best results. When I'm talking about production and the best results for production, what I mean is predicting and solving all of the problems seamlessly, right? If you don't dedicate enough time to production, you're not going to perfectly solve all of your production problems, and there will be friction. And I think that's a trade-off that you have to kind of be aware of. So my most important piece of advice is be aware that while I'll hopefully have some things in here that will help you get by, you're never going to be fulfilling all of the duties of a producer on a limited amount of the time that a producer would actually spend. I mean, again, it seems kind of obvious, but I do think it's worth pointing out because I think people can kind of overlook the value of production. Okay, so enough pre-rambling. Let's get into the actual meat of the thing. Let's talk about impediments, because really what I touched on before, the goal of a producer is finding and solving impediments. And impediments is just a fancy way of saying problems, really. But, you know, it's being a producer, you like to have fancy words that you don't really need to use. You could just say problems. But you call them impediments because it sounds a bit nicer. So I wanted to talk about what it looks like to be doing production and how you can kind of do that on a shoestring, budget, in quotes, really a fraction of time. One of the most important things that you need to hone if you're, let's say, leading a small indie team as a production skill is your ability to listen to red flags. Like, listen for the kinds of things that should be red flags that aren't problems per se, but are potential problems that you can dig into. Realistically, something that you'll probably learn being covering production stuff for your team is nobody ever... Well, I shouldn't say nobody because it might happen, but it's pretty rare that people will come straight to you and say, here's a problem that I need you to help me solve, right? I mean, like, that will maybe happen with some really specific types of things, but to be a really good producer, what you should be trying to do is figure out where these problems are, problems that people might not even realize are, in air quotes, problems, just kind of things that happen that you can spot that can be things to solve. These are the kind of red flags that I'm talking about. I've also heard it referred to as sniffing out bombs, like people unaware that they're sitting on a bomb that might be about to go off in a few weeks that they don't really know is a bomb. Your job is to kind of sniff out these fires, bombs, red flags, whatever you want to call them. So these are some of the types of things that they could sound like, right? Somebody talking in a meeting, oh, I thought I would have this done by now, but this thing keeps popping up. Or, oh, I keep working on these features, but I feel like I'm spending too much time working on whatever. Maybe it's bug fixing or something like that. These are the kinds of red flags that you should be training yourself to listen out for, because these are the things that will really reveal to you potential problems that people might not have even noticed, you know? Where will these things come up? Where will you hear about these things? Let's get more specific and talk about stand-ups a bit. Because I think stand-ups and a lot of things that we'll be referring to today, which are kind of agile processes, I'll explain that in a second. These are very important processes to be coordinating for a team. And part of your job as a producer is to get these things set up and off the ground and make sure that they're kind of happening. I'm not going to talk too much about like agile development and stuff here because I think that's not specifically what this talk is about. I want to stay a little bit high level here. But I do think it's important to at least give a general idea of what the core of agile is, because it is a kind of good theme to keep in mind for being a producer. Agile development, to me, there's one core tenet of it, which is making sure that a team has visibility over what they are doing and kind of clear, transparent communication about what they're doing. There's a lot more to it than that, obviously, but that's my one kind of bullet point that I think is the most important thing to keep in mind from agile development. And that's where some of these things like stand-ups, and we'll be talking about some other agile meetings or events that you should be implementing for your team. So the core idea of making sure things are transparent and communicative is a pretty simple one, but it will help your job a lot as a producer. So let's talk about stand-ups specifically. If you're not familiar with a stand-up, conceptually the goal is that you spend a little bit of time every day just checking in with the team and making sure the team has an easy and frequent opportunity to raise any impediments or problems. What will often happen in a team that doesn't have stand-ups is you'll see people will message on Discord or whatever about problems that are coming up. But again, similar to how we discussed before, a team won't always know a problem that is about to happen or even that is starting to happen for themselves. And so stand-ups are a good opportunity to frame a question around just discussing how people are feeling around their work and that kind of thing that will allow you opportunities to sniff out those red flags. So stand-ups are great. Encourage them. Don't spend too much time on them. I hear a lot of horror stories about stand-ups that turn into hour-long discussions. That is terrible, and it breaks my heart every time. So do your stand-ups, but make sure that they stay on target. Have a specific set of questions that you use that everyone answers. It's questions like, what's the thing that you're most worried about? I find that a great question. People will often not feel like they're worried about anything, but if you force them to give an answer, often it will reveal there's something that might just be a small thing, but it could be an opportunity for the team to kind of rally around and solve this problem, or for you as the producer to just take note of it and keep kind of following up with it in the future. Here you can see a picture of one of our stand-ups with a cat, and it looks like whoever took this photo has just had a nice soft drink, a nice Doritos there, so that's good for them. The other thing about stand-ups is they get samey pretty quickly, and if they get samey, people stop actually thinking about the questions before they answer them. So the eternal struggle for a producer is to make sure that people actually think about what their biggest concern is, so that they can actually think about it and actually give a real answer rather than just saying the default answer of, no, everything's fine. The no, everything's fine answer is a red flag also that you should note, because it means that your stand-ups aren't really getting where you want them to. So I advise you to mix up your stand-ups where you can. Change up the questions, change up the format, do cameras on, do cameras off, do whatever it is, just to kind of keep it a bit fresh every so often. Okay, cool. So that's a bit of an update on, a bit of a kind of primer on stand-ups, why they're important, and how they will help you sniff out some of these red flags. But as I said, people won't always bring you their problems, and even people won't always talk about the red flags. So how do we dig for them? To get more specific, if there's something that you find you're worried about from your kind of innate sense of being a producer or being any part of the team, it's important to know what are the kinds of questions that you can ask to start digging for problems. Something like, what part of the project are you most worried about? We touched on as potentially a stand-up question. But it's also a good question just to ask in kind of semi-regular check-ins. This will also help you get ahead of problems to a larger extent. I'm a programmer myself, and something that I will often find myself doing and catch myself doing is naturally shying away from parts of a project that I know might have complicated problems that I need to solve, right? Not even consciously, just as a subconscious thing of like, I don't quite know exactly how I'm going to solve something in my head, and so sometimes I work on easier tasks until I kind of have formulated that thought in my head. And that can be okay. I mean, that's kind of just a process of figuring things out. But it also can mean that there's actually a problem coming up if we're going to hit a task that we don't actually know how to solve, right? So you need to have the ability to dig for these kinds of problems. Here's some sample questions for this. What part of the project are you most worried about is one. Also, if you had a free week, what would you work on is another one. I like this one because I often find that, I'm speaking to my experience as a developer here. This probably applies outside of this as well. But often everyone wants to take a lot of pride in their work. And so often if you ask somebody what they would spend time on, there's often a thing where they think, I feel like this could be really cool, but I just haven't had enough time to work on it. Maybe it's not as high priority, etc. So this kind of question will help dig into those things that really can take your game from acceptable, where everything is a 7 out of 10, and then your game is okay, thumbs up, to great, where people have the opportunity to take their own design and passions into parts of the game that they care about and turn it into something that really stands out. So here's some example of these questions. Where can you use these questions? Well, one example is a stand-up, but I want to talk about another example, which is just a regular check-in, which I think is a great thing for a producer to be doing. Making sure that you are regularly meeting with your team and just having these kind of wider conversations. Something that I've realized more and more as I've become more senior is it's important to have time that you don't necessarily have an objective for, right? Time that is just time for the mind to wander, because that is often where you will find some of these problems and where you'll find great ideas and where you'll find all of these really cool things. So I'm talking about regular check-ins here as an opportunity to find potential red flags or problems, but it's also, of course, an opportunity for people to come up with great ideas that aren't problems, that are just incredible things that you can add to your game. So regular check-ins. Basically, the general gist is meet with your team fairly regularly, every 3 to 4 weeks probably, and just have time to talk about things, talk about what's on people's minds. Worries, fears, and problems obviously are part of it, but also it can be positive things, you know. I feel like I'm being a little bit negative here, and that's because when you have a limited amount of time as a producer, it can often solving problems is where that time will go towards. But if you have the time for it, thinking about where else things can go is obviously great. So don't just dig into worries, fears, and problems, even though I have it on this bullet point. Spend this time thinking about wherever things go related to your project, right? Because people have great ideas, and leveraging them by giving people time, the opportunity to talk about them and just kind of have them splash out is great. Just a question from Elliot on this one. Are we thinking about one-on-ones, a whole team meeting? Is it either or? I would encourage you to mix it up a bit. What we do is we have regular one-on-one type chats that are about this and some other stuff as well at our studio. But then we also do have regular team meetings that can also kind of have this stuff splash out. Sometimes it might be a stand-up. Somebody has a great idea and you think, okay, this is an idea we should talk about. Let's book some time after the stand-up to get into that as well. But for regular check-ins, I'd make sure at minimum you're at least having a one-on-one chat with team members every 3 to 4 weeks. I've also seen amongst other teams often things like playtesting meetings can be great examples of this, because while you have a loose goal of just playing the game that you're making, often things will devolve into conversations around like, oh, this feature's kind of cool, but what if it went in this direction instead? Or I like this, but how about this? It's a great opportunity for kind of ideas to blossom out. So I'd encourage you to do that kind of thing as well. Have maybe a weekly or fortnightly playtesting meeting where everyone just gets together and plays the game or watches people play the game or something like that to let kind of ideas flow. Ideas and potentially fears. Cool. So that's a few examples of the types of meetings that you can have to start catching red flags and start kind of getting ahead of problems. Getting ahead of the curve is the next thing I want to talk about. A lot of the things that we've talked about there are dealing with the things that are bubbling up at the moment. So that first level of production where you're just solving problems for your team. When you become a really strong producer, obviously, as I mentioned before, you stop operating on the problems that are happening right now, but start kind of looking ahead to what's going to cause a problem in the future. Predicting the upcoming problems, being ready to tackle them, etc. I think the classic image, this is lower resolution than I realized, apologies. The classic image that I see a lot in production talks is the duck that is calm on top with the furious legs kicking underneath, where the producer is spending a lot of effort kind of worrying about the things in the future and preemptively solving them so they can appear calm and collected and the rest of the team can operate without any friction. So how can you do that? Again, I'm going to give a kind of a brief introduction to this, but these are all kind of concepts and terminology that you can find if you search for other kind of agile ways of working types of things. So let's get into it. Here's the rough breakdown of what I would recommend every team be doing. So forecasting and kind of keeping an eye on velocity and kind of planning where you're going. For a really early indie team, often they won't have strong deadlines at all. I would advise the first step of this is making sure that you have some deadlines and objectives that you're working towards. And then once you have an objective, the question is, how do we know if we're going to hit this objective or not? And that's where you'll get into some of this kind of stuff. So the typical loop that you'll see is sizing and describing your cards, making sure you understand each task and how it needs to be done, and you know how long it will take to be done. Making estimates about how much you can get done. So you might have a planning meeting to say how much are we going to get done in this next fortnight. And then at the end of that fortnight, you might look back and see, okay, well, how did we actually do with that? Let's check the data that we've got and see what happens. So let's get into this in a bit more detail. Sizing your cards. I'm just going to jump forward for a second to this card here, this slide here, which is a kind of great visual example of the concept of relative sizing. Again, I'll stay pretty high level here, but conceptually, relative sizing is a tool that you use to make sure that you can compare different cards and say, is this card bigger, roughly equal to, or smaller than this other card? Some teams, when they first start out, might use things like how many days or how many hours does this thing take to complete, which is okay, but has a few problems. Things like, you know, the amount of days that one developer might spend on a card is different than the amount of days that another developer might need to spend on a card. That's obviously a problem. It means that you can only estimate through the lens of one particular person. Or if your team sizes change or other things change, you know your estimates in terms of hours or days just might not be accurate anymore. Contrasting to this, if you use relative sizing, you will have a kind of general and less specific, but potentially more helpful size that you can look at for cards. So, for example, if you look at, let's consider fruit as an example. Actually, no, let's consider these vehicles that we're seeing in front of us here. If we were sizing these vehicles, we might be asking the question of how heavy is this vehicle, right? If I asked you how heavy is a car, you could give a decent answer, but I'm sure you can't give me an exact specific answer for how heavy a car is or how heavy a bus is. If I say to you, which is heavier, a bus or a car? And is a bus twice as heavy as a car, 4 times as heavy? It's not as specific, but by comparatively assessing these things and doing relative sizing, you give up a little bit of specificity for more useful metrics in general. So that's the concept of relative sizing in a brief nutshell. What I'd recommend you doing is sizing your cards relatively. How big are these cards? Starting to make estimates for how much will get done in a week, in a fortnight. In Agile terminology, the word that they'd use is sprint, which is just a kind of block of work that you aim to do. And then look back and see how you go. I've got some examples of types of things that you might use to track how your work is going week on week in here. So here we've got one of our past projects a while ago. You can see kind of how much we're delivering per sprint and whether we feel like we're on track to complete by the end of our sprint or not. Obviously, you can see this red dotted line is telling us actually we're going to complete 3 weeks later than we expect to, right? As an example of how this works. This is not a great graph because this one didn't factor into account the fact that we were about to go on Christmas holidays, so it's a little bit off. But anyway, at the high level, this kind of conceptually demonstrates what we're talking about here. Taking note of how many tasks we complete or the relative size of tasks that we've completed, getting a rough estimate of how much we can complete week on week, and then using that to make predictions about whether we're going to hit these deadlines that we set for ourselves. So at a high level, this is the kind of thing that you should start doing and moving towards when you want to become a producer that is looking out ahead and solving problems. So obviously, at the end of a sprint, if I look at this graph as a producer, I'd say, okay, here's a red flag, right? We think we need to hit this by 31st of December. Actually, we're not going to hit it until the 21st of January. That's a red flag that we can catch and start making some decisions around, okay, do we want to spend more budget on this? Do we need to trim our scope to fit within these bounds, etc.? This is a problem that we probably might not have figured out without this level of tracking until maybe halfway through the project, maybe a bit further when realizing we're about 2 or 3 weeks behind. So this is the kind of thing that being a good producer will start to reveal to you is when you're running into these problems. All right, so that's at a high level what you should be doing as a producer, some of the types of techniques that you can be using. I'm going to spend a little bit of time also talking about the actual tools that you can be using here and doing a bit of comparison with a lens on being an indie team here. So card tracking. There's a lot of different things that you can use for card tracking, but Trello is the one that I recommend for an indie team because it's free, and that's great. The one that we use is Kanbanize. Obviously, teams use Jira, and these have more powerful features that let you do things like these reporting more automatically rather than needing to kind of synthesize the data yourself. But they are more expensive as a result. Trello is free, and it really contains all of the basics that you need to be doing here. You can create your columns, you can assign people's faces to things, you can set deadlines, you can do checklists, you can leave comments, etc. It will cover everything you need to be doing as an indie team pretty effectively. So Trello, it's great. Thumbs up, use it. The other thing that I like to recommend is just kind of Google Sheets, to be honest. I mean, this is a real life example of a Google Sheet that we use, and all of our projects are run off a number of Google Sheets, from these kinds of things, tracking timelines and stuff like that, to accounting sheets and kind of project invoicing and tracking and all kinds of things effectively run off Google Sheets, especially because I'm a programmer. I love kind of making functions and formulas inside my sheets. And again, free, very easy to get started with, free to use within kind of the constraints of a free Google account, which doesn't let you do everything, but definitely lets you do enough to get you off the ground. So yeah, Google Sheets, love it. I also see that we've got from Marty, Hack and Plan, another option that I've seen some game studios use as well. Yeah, I don't like Hack and Plan as much as something like Jira or Kanbanize, which are more enterprise options, but I feel like they do okay. But definitely, they're not extremely expensive, so you can use them if you want to, and they integrate into a number of different things, not just task tracking, but they have a few kind of those types of reports that you can start to use to track things like that, so that can be nice as well. And these are the tools that I recommend you get started with if you're kind of new to production for your indie team. Definitely get into Trello, definitely get into your Google Sheets. Google Sheets can do everything. I mean, it's wonderful. So yeah, that's the basics of what I want to talk about today. Let's just kind of quickly revisit some of the high-level learnings and make sure that we've kind of captured a few of the general themes that I want to talk about here. So general first point is you're only going to get out of production what you put into it. So make sure you put in an amount of effort that you're comfortable with, or at least be aware that you're making a sacrifice by not having a more active producer. Being a producer, you want to be sniffing out these red flags, which you can do at something like a stand-up, and actively digging for problems, which you can do at something like a regular check-in. Once you start getting comfortable being a producer, what you'll start to do is get out in front and start playing in the future, doing things like forecasting, predictions, velocity tracking, and starting to see how your team is delivering towards your objectives at a high level, making decisions around things like, oh, turns out we're going to need another artist, or, oh, turns out we might need to cut our scope to hit this objective that we want to set for ourselves. Being a producer is about setting objectives, managing the timelines, and using those as sources of information to feed into potential problems that you think might be coming up. And then in terms of tools, just a thumbs up for Trello and a thumbs up for Google Sheets. And that's what I want to talk to you about today. So thanks everyone for coming along. And now we have kind of question time, I suppose. Question from M. Would you approach production the same or similarly for a one-person team? Yes, I would. I mean, like, I think it's important to, as a team of any size, including one, to have some of these objectives and goals that you're working towards yourself. When I'm working on a solo project or a hobby project by myself, it can be very easy for me to not hold myself accountable in any kind of way. Something that I guess we've talked around, but I haven't explicitly said in this talk, is having a producer as a base level will hold you accountable. And I use that word, even though maybe it's a little bit harsher than what I mean. Really just ensure that you're setting goals. Even if you miss all these goals, having the goals and setting them and working towards them is a big thing to be doing to ensure that you're kind of on track for what you want to be delivering, right? Rather than what can often happen when you're an independent developer working just by yourself, is letting things just sit forever rather than actively making decisions. Even if you do want to, even if you say, I'm going to spend 2 months on my project, and at the end of those 2 months you realize it's not where you want it to be, at least you have a decision point after 2 months to make an active reflection on, okay, now will I spend another 1 month polishing up this thing that I think isn't there yet? How am I going to handle that, rather than just letting a project drag on forever without making those active decisions at steps along the way. So in short, yes, I would approach production the same for a one-person team. You might not need to go as hardcore with things like your prediction into the future and stuff like that. And I don't know if I'd recommend you have a one-on-one with yourself. Actually, now that I say that, I kind of do like the idea of that, setting yourself down for a one-on-one and asking yourself some of the questions around what are your fears, what are your hopes, etc. for a project. So maybe I would just recommend doing the exact same thing. That's interesting. I hadn't thought about it through that lens, but I think it could be interesting. Maybe a little bit different the way you would approach it, but still very helpful, I think. So in short, M, yes. Anne has a question. We've mentioned managing the team, but what about the project managers / producers themselves? How should these in leadership positions manage their own well-being / work demands? This is an interesting one. Often things like task tracking and Trello won't include production tasks. I'll often work with teams that don't necessarily have production tasks listed on their boards alongside other, more in air quotes developer-y tasks. I think that's a mistake. I think it's important to make sure that the team is aware of all the work that the team is doing, whether that's a production task like setting up a new reporting metric or a new sheet to help track whatever it is to track velocity. All of these things are tasks that I think are worth flagging, because by holding yourself to that same standard, you will start noticing things about the way that you're working, the types of red flags that you might actually have been sitting on for yourself. A potential red flag that you might see is if a card gets stuck in the doing column for a long time, for example. And it can be very easy to spot that when it's a different team member that isn't you, the producer. But often for a producer, there's almost like it's interesting. You set a lower bar of quality for yourself than you do for the rest of your team, or you kind of have less expectations for yourself, or more you feel like, oh, this will be fine because I'm kind of managing it. Those types of expectations than you would for your team. So I would really recommend holding yourself to the same standard, and you will start to use that to find some of your own subconscious avoiding of red flags that you find easy to notice for the rest of your team. Yeah. Did I answer your question, Anne? I didn't answer the question about managing your own well-being, I suppose. To go back to the section on having one-on-ones with yourself, this is something that I'm probably going to try and start doing in the future, just because it's come up in this conversation. And I think it's probably quite an interesting way to be more aware of your own potential worries and fears. So try that. I'm definitely going to try that. I think it's interesting. Cool. More questions, anybody? I'd be interested to hear. It was a while ago that I was assisting to run, kind of got sidelined because of COVID, a regular meeting for kind of indie game developers in Sydney, where people would come along and just talk about the games that they were working on and talk about problems, usually production problems with their game, kind of raising it to the table, which is, usually each fortnight we'd have, or each month we'd have, maybe 5 or 6 different game developers coming along, and just kind of raise these topics to the entire table and get some feedback and thoughts on some of the production problems that people were facing. And I thought that was often quite a useful set of conversations, both for myself and for the people who are bringing these problems. And so I would recommend, if anyone has any of these types of production issues or anything like that they want to raise, please do feel free to, because it's the wisdom of the crowd can be really helpful in getting perspective on some of these things. I'd love to hear/learn about more examples of some of the stand-up questions you can use. Yes, let me get into. Can you all see my screen there? Really what I like to see for stand-up questions are basically smaller versions of questions that we'd use during a retro. So if you're not familiar with a retro, it's another type of agile meeting where you'll talk about some of these problems and impediments at a slightly higher level view. Basically, retros are often chances for teams to talk about things that went well and celebrate some wins, as well as things that didn't go so well and talk about potential problems, which are obviously opportunities for improvement, and improve their kind of dynamics and processes as a team. And so the kinds of questions that you might use for retros, let's see, I know Spotify has a retro kit, are often questions around digging at those problems and finding wins. And so I like to think about stand-ups as almost a smaller opportunity for that. And so you can often do smaller versions of types of retro questions at stand-ups. So that's where you can find some other examples of stand-up questions at a higher level. Oh my God, retro activity ideas. I'm trying to find, there's a specific website that, Fun Retrospectives, that's the one, that has a bunch of different types of retrospective activities. And often you can find a way to ask a question that gets at these same types of things. So let's say Checkin. So one example that I know of is thinking about a boat and thinking about the sails that are pushing the boat forward and the water that is dragging the boat back. And you can ask questions about, okay, well, what is pushing you forward? What are you excited about at your work? What are the potential anchors that are dragging you back? Some of these questions I see Ronnie in chat typing because I asked him this exact same question at a recent check-in. But looking at some of these retro activities, like these are all kinds of things you could do in a stand-up that might mix it up. So draw your feelings, like draw how things are going. Give an anonymous note around a question, anonymously asking, hey, are you nervous about the work that you've got going on or anything like that? What's one word that describes kind of how you're feeling about your work? I've seen people hold up between 1 to 5 fingers to represent like how apprehensive versus how excited they are for their work at the moment. Like these are all effectively retrospective activities that have just been adapted or can be quite easily adapted into stand-up questions. Happiness radar. I mean, there's a bunch of these types of things. Hopefully that answered your question, Elliot. Specific ones that I use will often use a general check-in of how are you feeling on a scale of 1 to 7, which I like because people never expect a scale to go from 1 to 7, and it forces people to think about, okay, well, what am I actually on this scale? What are your biggest worries is one of my favorite ones. Usually we'll check in on what got done since last stand-up as a way to flag if there's anything that's kind of dragging on. That's a potential red flag as well. So hopefully some of those are useful examples. I imagine that some of the production also involves dealing with people's emotions, fears, etc. How do you navigate this or get good at it? Is it something you just get better at with experience? That's interesting. Yeah, I mean, especially on smaller teams, like managing mental health is important. I wouldn't necessarily say that I would consider it something that a producer should be responsible for, but more in general, like being aware of, I guess where I would consider it potentially something that producers should be aware of is in terms of mental health as related to any type of health, obviously, can have impacts on your production, right? And so I suppose I would say it's important for a producer to kind of be aware of factors outside of somebody's control, whether it be mental health or health in general that can impact like your ability to adhere to a deadline and stuff like that. I suppose I wouldn't call this necessarily a production issue and more just a general like team leader thing to be aware of, kind of setting the culture for a team, making sure that as a team you're kind of aware and cognizant that people can be sick, whether that's physically or having mental health, things that might get in the way of people coming to work or whatever. Like that's all very normal and happens to everybody, and part of building a good team is building a culture that is accepting of that. So yeah, I don't know if necessarily I would consider it a production thing as opposed to just a general team cultural thing to be aware of, and specifically probably a thing to be aware of for people who are leading a team, which maybe is overlap with people who are kind of acting as producers, but it might not necessarily be. How do you get good at that, though, is an interesting facet to the question. I really think rather than thinking about getting good at managing people's emotions and fears, what I would consider is getting good at building a space where people can feel comfortable raising their fears and those kinds of things. So it's not necessarily about dealing with or managing people's emotions, but instead creating a space and a team where people feel like they can raise these things and they'll be handled with sensitivity and love and care, right? Like if someone raises, I'm feeling unwell or I need to take a mental health day, they feel like they can trust that the team will say, hey, that's great, let us know if we can do anything to help, right? Like take the time you need, etc. So I guess my top tip for that is just be cognizant that things outside of people's control get in the way, and build a culture that is welcoming and supporting of that fact, I suppose. I don't know. I don't necessarily think I fully answered that question, but hopefully I talked around the specific aspects of it to be helpful. I see that Marty has posted a link on psychological safety, which I think is a more specific and slightly more corporate version of the thing that I was talking about as well. I would encourage people to learn about and understand psychological safety more, because it is important if you're working in a team to understand how you can build teams that feel psychologically safe, e.g. feel like they can raise concerns and potential problems and all that stuff without feeling like it will be perceived as negative or an attack or any of these kind of poor ways that things can sometimes be perceived. Cool. Any other questions, folks?
We've technically gone over time, but
Have we?
it seems like people are still typing questions.
Yeah, I mean,
If
feel
you're,
free to ask questions if people want to.
yeah.
I'm just going to dig through some more of these retro activities to see if there are any other cool ideas for potential stand-up questions. Our stand-ups involve a lot of show and tell, which I think you said is bad. What would the normal outlet for this part be? So, to dive into this a bit more, I don't think inherently, like, show and tell in air quotes is terrible, although maybe it's not the right format for a stand-up. What I see as being a problem with stand-ups a lot of the time is a few major problems. One is if people are demoing stuff that they're working on every day, that's going to start eating up a lot of time during the day and potentially not be relevant to everyone that's in a stand-up, right? The real things that make stand-ups toxic and terrible is if a stand-up goes for half an hour or 45 minutes and one person maybe speaks for about 30 minutes of that time and everyone else is maybe just giving a brief status update to that one person. Like it leads to stand-ups actually not being about the thing that they are so good for, which is finding actual problems. It's interesting. So for things like demoing, I would say try having a regular demo at the end of your sprint or something where everyone can show off work that they're really proud of. Something like a sprint review often is a great format for that. But try not to let your stand-ups grow too long to which people can check out of 60 or 70% of them. If somebody's checking out for 70% of a stand-up, it means they're not actually going to be thinking about some of these questions and they're going to give a very surface level answer, which is going to cause problems. So yeah. What the normal outlet for this part would be is probably just an end of sprint demo or a sprint review. No worries. All right. Any other questions, folks? I mean, if you think of questions, you can always just feel free to kind of post them in the Discord and tag me, and I'll happily chat more about stuff. All right.